The first thing the Vorath did when the human ship docked was count them. Not out of hospitality, out of calculation. Delegate Grack stood at the end of the docking bridge with 4 of his people behind him, and his pale silver eyes moved over each human who stepped off the ship like he was reading numbers on a page. He counted 12 humans. He noted their sizes. He noted how they walked. His expression did not change, but the junior observer beside him, a younger Vorath named Yeva, saw his shoulders drop slightly. The gesture, in Vorath body language, meant smaller than expected. The station was called Juram Kel. It floated between 2 dead moons in neutral space, built from black stone and grey light, and it had hosted the Darra, the Vorath Game Summit, for over 300 years. Every species that wanted a seat at the Galactic Council had to earn it here. No exceptions had ever been made. No outsider had ever won more than 1 game in the summit's entire history. Captain Rail shook Grack's hand the way humans do, firm, brief, looking him in the eye. Grack accepted it the way the Vorath do, with total stillness, revealing nothing. 7 games, Grack said. 7 days. Standard rules apply. Your delegation competes. Our delegation competes. The elders judge. You are welcome to Juram Kel. Rail nodded. We accept. Behind him, the crew filed onto the station. Dr. Fenn came through holding a bag in one hand and a small girl's wrist in the other. The girl had dark eyes and messy hair, and she was holding a stuffed cloth dragon against her chest. Its button eyes were mismatched, one faced forward, one faced slightly left. The toy was old and worn and clearly loved. Yeva looked at the child. The child did not look at Yeva. She was looking at the far end of the docking corridor, where it curved left toward the interior of the station. Fenn caught Rail's eye and mouthed the word sorry. He had explained it twice already on the ship. There had been no one to leave her with. Her name was Darra. She was 7 years old. She would stay out of the way. Rail had said fine. He had meant it. The summit was what mattered. The Vorath gave the humans a tour of Juram Kel, long halls of dark stone, arched ceilings carved with the names of every species that had competed in the Darra, losing species and winning species both, because the Vorath believed that the record of a contest mattered more than the outcome. Grack explained this while walking. He explained it in a tone that suggested he did not believe the humans would add much to the record. The game hall was the last stop on the tour. It was enormous. The floor was pale and smooth, marked in the center with a wide circle. Around the circle, tiered seating rose to the ceiling. Everything about the room was designed to make the person standing in the center feel very alone and very visible. Grack explained the first game. It was called the Silence Trial. Tomorrow, 1 human, 1 Vorath. The rules were simple: sit across from each other, remain still, remain silent, do not react. The Vorath elders would deliver personalized statements to each competitor, chosen carefully, aimed at the things a person most feared or regretted. The last one to flinch won. We have not lost this game, Grack said, in 61 years. Rail said nothing. Around him, his crew said nothing either. They were all thinking the same thing, but none of them said it out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real. It was Nura, the ship's engineer, who noticed first. She tugged on Fenn's sleeve and pointed. Darra was gone. They found her 2 minutes later, sitting cross-legged in the center of the game hall floor, sable in her lap. She had not made a sound. She had simply walked away during Grack's speech, found the arena floor, and sat down in the circle as if she had been looking for it the whole time. 2 Vorath guards appeared from a side door and moved toward her. Darra watched them come. She did not move. She did not look afraid. She looked the way she always looked, like she was reading something that no one else could see. Fenn reached her first, scooped her up gently, and carried her back. I'm sorry, he said to the room. She wanders. Grack watched the child being carried away. His expression did not change. But Yeva was watching from the side of the room, and she was writing in the small log she kept tucked against her wrist. She did not write about the child wandering. She wrote about something else. The guards had moved toward the girl from the left and the right at the same time, both of them, a standard flanking approach because the hall was wide. There was no reason a child should have known where to look first. But Darra had looked at the left guard before he moved, a full 2 seconds before he stepped out of the doorway. Yeva tapped her stylus against the log slowly. She looked at the empty circle on the floor where the child had been sitting. She wrote, "How did she know?" Then she closed the log and followed the group back to the residential wing and said nothing to anyone. Nobody slept well that first night on Juram Kel. The rooms the Vorath provided were fine, clean, temperature-controlled, quiet, but the walls were black stone and the light came from strips near the floor rather than overhead, which gave everything a strange, sunken look, like being inside a very tidy cave. Nura said it felt like the station was watching them sleep. Fen said that was just anxiety talking. Nura said yes, obviously, that was exactly what she was describing. Darra slept deeply, she always did. She curled up on her side with Sable tucked under her chin and was out within minutes. Fen sat on the edge of his own bed for a long time, watching her breathe, and then quietly went over his notes about the Silence trial. The next morning, the game hall filled with Vorath observers. They came in quietly, took their seats in the tiered rows, and sat with their hands folded. No noise, no restlessness. They had done this many times before. Rael walked to the center circle. Across from him sat a Vorath elder named Soth, older than Grak, thinner, with pale hands and eyes so light they looked almost white. He was the game master of the Keldara. He had administered the Silence trial for 20 years. He sat with his back completely straight and his hands in his lap, and he looked at Rael the way a surgeon looks at a patient, not unkindly, but without warmth. The rules were read aloud by a Vorath attendant, then silence fell. The elders began. They did not shout, they did not try to frighten. They spoke in low, even voices, one at a time, each one reading from a file compiled on each competitor. How they compiled those files in one day was something Rael had not asked about. He suspected the answer would not be comforting. They knew about the accident on his previous posting. They named the crewman who had died. They described what he had said in his last report about his captain's decision-making. They were precise, they were calm, they were devastating. Rael held on for 41 minutes. The Vorath observers counted. When his jaw finally tightened, just once, just barely, the attendant rang a soft bell and the trial ended. Rael stood up. He breathed out slowly through his nose. He walked back to the human section of the seating, and Nura put a hand on his shoulder, and he sat down. Humans 0, Vorath 1. Afterward, when the observers filtered out, and the attendants began resetting the room, something happened that no one planned for. Soth stayed behind to review the next day's materials at the side table near the wall. It was his habit. He worked alone in the emptied hall after every trial. He was 20 minutes into his notes when he became aware that he was not alone. He looked up. The child was sitting 6 feet away from him, cross-legged on the floor, back straight, Sable in her lap. She was looking at him, or more precisely, she was looking at the cloth dragon, which she held tilted slightly forward, its mismatched button eyes aimed in his direction. Soth set his stylus down. "How did you get in here?" he asked. Darra said nothing. Soth was not a man who was easily unsettled. He had administered the Silence trial for 2 decades. He had made decorated military officers weep. He looked at the child for a long moment and then said, in a careful voice, the kind of thing he said to competitors who needed to understand their position, "You are very small. Your people are very far from home. You should not be here." Darra looked at Sable. Sable's button eyes stayed on Soth. Soth added, because the quiet was becoming unusual, "The games will not go well for your people. It would be kinder if you understood this now." Nothing, not a shift in her expression, not a blink that came at a wrong time. Soth had spent a career reading people. He knew what forced stillness looked like, the locked jaw, the over-controlled breathing, the slight dilation of the eyes from concentration. He knew what genuine calm looked like too. He had seen it perhaps 4 times in his life, always in very old Vorath who had made peace with very hard things. This child looked like the second kind. He picked up his stylus again, because he was not going to be unsettled by a 7-year-old with a stuffed toy. He returned to his notes. He worked for another 10 minutes. When he looked up again, she was gone. The space where she had been sitting was empty. He had not heard her leave. Soth sat still for a moment. Then he looked down at his notes. Then he looked back at the empty floor. He did not tell Grak. He was not sure why. It did not seem relevant. It was a child. Children wandered. It meant nothing. But that night, alone in his room, he found himself thinking about the way she had looked at him, or rather, the way she had not looked at him, and why that had felt, somehow, more attentive than any direct gaze he had ever received. He did not write it in his log. He went to sleep. In the human wing, Darra was already asleep too, sable tucked under her chin as always. Fen had not even known she was gone. Yeva, in her own room, added 3 lines to her log. She wrote, "The child returned to the game hall alone. She sat near Soth for approximately 30 minutes by my count from the corridor. She left without being dismissed." Then she wrote, "Soth did not report it." Then she wrote, "Why not?" She underlined the last line twice and turned off her light. On the second day, Dr. Fen competed in the memory labyrinth. The labyrinth was a structure that took up a full wing of Juram Kel. It was built from movable walls that shifted every 90 seconds according to a pattern. The pattern was not random. It followed a logic, a deep, recursive logic that the Vorath had developed over generations. The goal was to reach the center room. No outsider ever had. Most outside competitors made it roughly halfway before the walls closed around them and the game ended. Fen mapped as he walked. He had a strong memory for structures. It was why Rael had chosen him. He counted his steps. He tracked the wall shifts with a system he had worked out the night before, tapping his fingers against his leg in a rhythm to keep his internal clock aligned with the 90-second intervals. He made it 94% of the way. The room was impossibly close. He could hear the faint hum of the center chamber ahead. Then the walls shifted, a configuration he had not predicted, and the path closed. The bell rang. The game ended. The Vorath observers were silent for a moment. Then there was a sound, not quite applause, but a kind of collective exhale, the sound a crowd makes when something unexpected happens. Grak's expression did not change, but Yeva saw him straighten slightly in his seat. The previous outsider record had been 62%. Fen had shattered it without reaching the goal. Humans still 0, but the silence in the room had changed texture. On the third day, Neura competed in the endurance spiral, a physical trial in which the competitor was placed in a chamber of shifting gravity and had to remain upright, moving constantly for as long as possible. The Vorath won through biological advantage. Their inner ear structure was different. They were built for it. Neura lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. The previous outsider record was 2 hours and 3 minutes. When she finally went down, not from pain, but from genuine muscle failure, her legs simply stopping, the Vorath observers made that same sound again, louder this time. She walked out of the chamber on Rael's arm, legs shaking, and sat down hard on the bench. Someone handed her water. She drank it and stared at the ceiling. "Not bad," she said. "Not bad at all," Rael said. Humans 0, Vorath 3, but there was a crack in the air that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Yeva noticed something else, though. She had been noticing it since the first day, adding to her log each time. She went back through her notes the evening of the third day and laid them out in order. Before the silence trial, the child had been found in the game hall, sitting in the center circle. Rael had then performed better in the silence trial than any outsider in 61 years. Before the memory labyrinth, Yeva had spotted the child alone in the observation gallery above the maze, before the maze was active. She had been sitting on the railing ledge, sable in her lap, watching the walls below in their resting configuration for nearly an hour. Before the endurance spiral, a maintenance worker had reported a small human girl sitting near the calibration station for the gravity chamber. She had not touched anything. She had watched the technicians run their morning checks and then walked away. 3 games, 3 pre-game appearances by the child, 3 outsider records broken. Yeva brought this to Grak. Grak looked at her log. He handed it back. She is a child. She wanders because the station is new and children are curious. You are finding patterns where there are none. I don't think I am, Yeva said. What is your theory then? Grak asked, with the tone he used when he considered something beneath real discussion. I think she is scouting, Yeva said. I think she watches the games before they happen and tells the humans something. I think she is their preparation. Grak was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she does not speak to them. I have reviewed the corridor records. She spends time with the father, but she says almost nothing. The other night before the labyrinth game, she sat with him for 2 hours and spoke 4 words. 4 words that we recorded, Yeva said. Grak gave her a long look. Then he said, the games continue tomorrow. Watch the girl if you want, but do not interrupt the summit over a child with a toy. Yeva went back to her room. She added to her log. She wrote, Grak is not wrong that she doesn't speak, but he is asking the wrong question. The question is not what she says. The question is what she shows. She paused. Then she wrote, the humans improve most in the areas where she has been watching. Fen mapped the maze better than anyone in history. Nura held the gravity field longer than anyone in history. They are not just performing well, they are performing as if they had seen something the Vorath did not think was visible. She put her stylus down. Outside her room, the station hummed. In the human wing, Darra was drawing on a small pad of paper Nura had given her. She was drawing the game hall. Every detail was exact, the circle on the floor, the position of the judges' seats, the angle of the corridor that led to the side room. She drew slowly, without hesitation. When she was done, she set the pad aside, curled up next to Sable, and went to sleep. Fen saw the drawing when he checked on her. He picked it up and looked at it for a long time. Then he set it down carefully, as if it was something delicate, and sat in the chair by the door and did not sleep for a while. The 4th game was called The Reckoning, and it nearly did not happen at all. At the 5th hour of the 4th day, the crew member assigned to compete, a young navigation officer named Bren, came down with a reaction to something in the station's food supply. It was not dangerous. It was also completely incapacitating. He spent the morning unable to stand without the room spinning. Rail informed Grak of the situation and requested a 1-day postponement. Grak declined. The Caldara schedule was fixed. It had been fixed for 300 years. A postponement would require a ruling from the Elder Council, which could take days, which would throw the entire summit into procedural limbo. The game would be played now or forfeited. Rail stood in the corridor outside Bren's room and thought through his options. He had run through all of them twice and was starting a 3rd pass when he heard small feet on the stone floor. Darra walked past him. She walked down the corridor, turned the corner, and kept going. Rail followed because she was 7 and the station was large and he felt responsible. He caught up with her at the entrance to the game hall. She pushed the door open and walked inside. She went to the center circle. She sat down. Across the room, the Vorath setup was already complete. The game table was in place in the center of the circle. 2 chairs facing each other. And in one of the chairs, because he had inserted himself into this game specifically as a statement of Vorath confidence, sat Soth. The game master looked up. Darra sat down in the empty chair. She placed Sable on the table between them. Sable's mismatched eyes faced Soth. The room was not full yet. Observers were still filtering in. Yeva, who had been following Darra at a careful distance for 3 days, slipped into a seat near the side door and opened her log. Rail came through the main entrance at a near run. He looked at the table. He looked at Darra. He started toward her. Grak appeared at his elbow. The rules permit a substitute, Grak said, with something in his voice that was almost amusement. If this is your substitute. She is 7 years old, Rail said. The rules set no age requirement, Grak said. The Vorath are not concerned. Rail looked at Darra. She was looking at Sable. She had not looked at him. He could not tell if she wanted help or if she wanted him to sit down and be quiet. He stayed very still, which is what a person does when they have no idea what to do. Soth said nothing. He was looking at the child with that same careful look he had when he reviewed a competitor's file. He did not ask for her removal. He did not request a delay. The attendant read the rules. In the reckoning, each player held a card with a number from 1 to 100, chosen randomly, face down, unknown to the other player. Using only yes or no questions, each player tried to identify the other's number. First player to name the correct number won. There was no time limit. The game ended when one player correctly named the other's number, or both players agreed to stop. The bell rang. Darra asked 3 questions. Her voice was small but clear in the big room. Is your number higher than 50? Soth answered yes. Is your number higher than 75? Soth answered yes. Is your number odd? Soth answered no. Darra looked at Sable for 4 seconds. Then she said, 88. The attendant checked the card. He looked up. He confirmed it. The room made a sound, like something breaking slowly. Now it was Soth's turn. He asked his first question. Darra said nothing. The room went very quiet. Soth waited. He asked again. Darra looked at Sable. She did not speak. The reckoning had no rule requiring a player to answer out loud. No one had ever refused because no one had ever thought to refuse. The rules said you asked yes or no questions. They did not say the other player had to say yes or no. They said nothing about silence. Soth understood immediately that he was in an entirely new situation. He looked at her face. He looked at Sable. He looked at her hands, which were resting quietly on the table. He looked at her breathing. He asked 4 more questions, each time getting nothing but stillness. And each time, even without an answer, he kept looking, because that was what you did in the reckoning. You read the other person. He chose a number. 44. The attendant checked the card. He paused. He looked again. He confirmed the number was not 44. The bell rang. The game was over. Darra had not answered a single question, and Soth had still guessed wrong. The observers did not make the exhale sound this time. This time, the room was simply silent in the way rooms go silent when something happens that no one has language for yet. Humans 1, Vorath 3. Rael sat down in the nearest seat and put his face in his hands for a moment, not in distress, just in the particular overwhelming feeling of something you did not plan for working out. Darra picked up Sable, got down from the chair, and walked back to where Fen was standing near the door. He looked at her. She looked at Sable. She did not explain anything because she did not seem to think there was anything to explain. At the game table, Soth sat alone for a moment. He turned the card over in his fingers. He looked at where the child had been sitting. He looked at the space on the table where the cloth dragon had been. He had spent the entire game trying to read her silence and had still guessed wrong. He was not sure if she had beaten him with a strategy or simply by being, somehow, completely unreadable. He did not know which possibility he found more troubling. There was a rest day between games 4 and 5, and Yeva used it. She requested, through the formal channel, permission to spend time with the child in a cultural observation capacity. Grak approved it without much interest. Rael approved it cautiously. Fen approved it with a handshake and the quiet relief of a single parent who had not had a free hour in 4 days. They met in the station's small garden corridor, a stretch of the station where someone had installed boxes of low-light plants that grew in silence. It was the calmest place on Juram Kel. Darra was already there when Yeva arrived. She was sitting on the floor next to a planter, not touching the plants, just looking at them. Sable was in her lap. Yeva sat down nearby, not too close, and opened her log. Then she closed it because she had a feeling that writing notes would change things. She set it aside. They sat like that for a while. Darra did not acknowledge Yeva's arrival and did not seem bothered by it either. She just continued existing, which Yeva was beginning to understand was what Darra mostly did. Yeva had brought food from the Vorath kitchen, small round things that were not exactly sweet, and not exactly savory, but fell somewhere comfortable in between. She set some on the floor between them. Darra looked at them for a moment, and then took one and ate it slowly. "Can I see your dragon?" Yeva asked. Darra held Sable out. Yeva reached for it. Darra made a small sound, not a no, but a wait, and repositioned Yeva's hands. She moved Yeva's fingers so the thumb sat under the dragon's body and the other hand supported the back. The correct way to hold it. Yeva held it that way. She turned Sable over slowly, studying the toy. The cloth was worn thin in places from many years of being held. The stitching around the wings was slightly different from the body, repaired maybe more than once. The eyes were what she kept returning to. One button faced straight forward, the other tilted left. It was subtle, maybe a manufacturing flaw, maybe deliberate. When you held Sable at the angle Darra always held it, the forward eye faced whoever was in front of Darra, and the sideways eye covered a significant portion of the peripheral space to the left. Yeva handed Sable back carefully, the right way. "She sees more than we think," Yeva said quietly. She was talking about the dragon, but she was not talking about the dragon. For the rest of the morning, Yeva simply watched. Darra was not passive. That was the first thing to understand. People assumed she was passive because she was quiet, because she did not talk, because she did not run around the way other children might. But she was constantly doing something. Her eyes moved. Not the way anxious eyes move, darting, jumping, but slowly, deliberately, covering a room the way a camera covers a room, making sure nothing was missed. A Vorath guard walked past the garden corridor entrance. Darra's eyes tracked him before his footsteps were audible. Yeva had not heard him yet. She checked the corridor. Yes, the guard had appeared and looked back at Darra, who had already returned her attention to the plants. Later, two human crew members walked past speaking to each other. One of them laughed. The other one had a tightness around his eyes that said the laugh was polite rather than genuine. Darra watched them until they were out of sight. Yeva said carefully, "You knew the guard was coming." Darra said nothing. "You knew because you heard something or saw something before I did," Yeva said. Still nothing, but Darra turned Sable slightly, and for a moment the forward button eye was looking directly at Yeva. Yeva sat with that for a while. Then she said, "You look at things with Sable, not with your eyes, so people don't know you're looking." Darra stroked Sable's wing with one finger. It was not an answer. It was also not a denial. Yeva thought about everything she had logged. Darra sitting in the game hall before the silence trial. Darra watching the maze walls before the labyrinth. Darra at the calibration station before the spiral. 3 games, 3 instances of being completely ignored by every Vorath on the station because she was a child with a toy wandering around. And that was the whole thing. Yeva wrote it in her log that night, slowly, trying to make sure each word was right. She wrote, "The child is not a mystery. She is the simplest thing in the world, a person who learned very early that no one was going to look at her, so she learned to look at everyone else instead. She reads bodies the way a linguist reads text. She reads rooms the way an engineer reads a structure. She has probably been doing it since she was old enough to understand that silence and stillness made her invisible, and invisibility was the only space where she felt safe." She paused. She added, "No one guarded themselves around her, not once. Not a single Vorath on this station modified their behavior because of her presence. She walked through restricted spaces. She sat next to Soth while he worked. She watched the technicians calibrate the gravity chamber. She watched everything, and nobody stopped her because nobody thought she was watching." Yeva set the log down. Outside, the station hummed in the dark. She picked the log back up and added one more line, the most important one. She wrote, "We have been playing against the wrong human." She underlined it. Then she turned off the light and lay in the dark and thought about Sable's mismatched eyes and which direction each one faced and what exactly a 7-year-old sees when nobody thinks she's looking. Game 5 was a physical one. The humans always knew it would be. The Vorath called it the Chord, a coordination trial where 2 competitors had to mirror each other's movements exactly in real time across a distance. The Vorath nervous system was built for this. Their reflexes operated on a slightly different time scale than a human's, and their peripheral perception was wider. There was no preparation that could bridge that gap. Rail competed personally. He lasted longer than the delegation expected, moving with careful, deliberate control rather than speed. He kept pace with his Vorath opponent for nearly 20 minutes before the gap widened too far to close. When the bell rang, he nodded once, as he always did, and walked back. Humans 1, Vorath 4, 1 game left. The final game of the Darra was the Accord. Soth explained it to both delegations together in the game hall, standing before the empty center circle. His voice was measured. It always was. But Yeva, sitting 3 rows behind the human delegation, thought his eyes moved to the child once before he began speaking. The Accord was not a competition in the normal sense. Each side would present, in silence, something true about themselves, something real, something they had never shown to outsiders. The assembled elders would judge which offering was more genuine. The side whose offering was judged more true would earn the final point. No costumes, no speeches, no performance, just something real. The Vorath always won this game because they always brought something staged beautifully enough to look unstaged. They had done it 17 times. Rail spent the afternoon preparing. He had the crew gather quietly in the common room. He talked about what humanity could show. Someone suggested the history files, the long record of human survival across centuries of difficulty. Someone else suggested music. Someone suggested they simply stand together and say nothing at all. Rail was nodding at the last suggestion when Darra walked to the door, stopped, and turned to look at the room. The crew looked back at her. She was holding Sable against her chest. She looked the way she always looked, quiet, still, watching. Then she walked out. The room was silent for a moment. Fen stood up slowly. He looked at the doorway. He sat back down. He did not say anything. "Let her," Nura said quietly. The game hall was full the next morning. Vorath observers packed every tier. The elders were in their seats. Grax sat with his hands folded. Soth stood to the side. The Vorath presented first. 4 senior delegates carried out a carved stone, the founding stone of Juram Kel, nearly 400 years old, inscribed with the names of every species the Vorath had ever welcomed into contact. It was beautiful. It was heavy. It was absolutely chosen to impress. Then it was the humans' turn. Rail stood. He looked at his crew. He looked at the center circle. Then he stepped aside and put his hand out, low, toward the small person standing at the end of the bench. Darra walked to the center of the floor. She sat down, cross-legged as always, Sable in her lap. She did nothing else. For a moment, the hall waited. Grax's expression flickered, something between confusion and dismissal. And then the humans started crying. Not 1 or 2, all of them. Not in the loud, performative way grief sometimes shows itself. In the quiet, helpless way, the kind that surprises you, that comes up from somewhere you didn't know was full. Nura pressed her sleeve to her face. Bren, still pale from the food reaction, dropped his head. Fen did not try to stop it. He sat with his hands folded and his eyes wet and his face very still. Rail stood with his arms at his sides, and he cried without making a sound. Because every one of them knew what Sable was. They knew that Darra had carried that toy across the galaxy because there was no one to leave her with, because her father had no one to help him, because they were a small crew on a long assignment doing something important, and she had come along the way children come along things, without being asked, without having a choice, just being brought because there was nowhere else to go. They knew what it was to carry something small and soft into a hard universe because you needed it. They knew what Sable meant when you had been away from everything familiar for a long time, and the only thing that was yours was a cloth dragon with mismatched button eyes. They knew without being told, the way people know the things that are true about all of them at once. The Vorath elders watched the humans cry over a stuffed toy. They conferred for a very long time. When the head elder spoke, her voice was careful and quiet. She said that the Vorath offering had shown the history of a great people. She said the human offering had shown something else. She said what the humans had shown was grief and love, and the particular human way of carrying both at the same time, without shame, in a room full of strangers. She said the accord went to humanity. Final score 2-4. Humanity lost the Darra. And then Grax said something that had never been said in 300 years of hosting. He said, "We would like to offer a second summit." He said it carefully, as if the words were new and he was not sure they would hold weight. Not as a concession, as an invitation. "You are the first delegation in our history to win 2 games. We would like to know you better." In the docking bay, as the crew prepared to leave, Soth found Darra standing alone near the ship's boarding ramp. He walked toward her slowly, the way people approach things they are not entirely sure about. He crouched down until he was at her height. He looked at Sable. He looked at her face. He reached into his coat. He brought out a small carved totem, dark wood, worn smooth at the edges, shaped into a curling creature that was not quite a dragon and not quite anything else. It was the kind of thing young Vorath received at their first game trial, something personal, something that went everywhere with you. He placed it in her free hand. Darra looked at it. She looked at Sable. She looked up at Soth with the same quiet, reading look she always had. Then she tilted Sable forward, very slightly, so the forward button eye was looking at the totem in her hand, as if introducing them. Soth stood up. He did not smile, because Vorath did not smile, but something in his face settled into a different shape than it had been in. He walked away. She watched him go. On the observation deck, as the ship pulled away from Juram Kel, Yeva stood at the window until the vessel was a small bright point against the dark. Then she picked up her log and read back through everything she had written over 7 days. She added one final line. She wrote, "The child won more than any game. She won the thing the Darra was always supposed to find, someone worth knowing." She closed the log. She looked at the dark. She did not feel like she had lost.